Bill is the 8th survivor of Dead by Daylight, having been introduced in Chapter 3.5, Left Behind. While this chapter was based on the hit Valve game Left 4 Dead and pulled Bill directly from there, Bill was the only new survivor, while the other Left 4 Dead characters were just represented by cosmetic items given to the other survivors, which I think is a bit of a shame. Had this DLC come out in modern times, the other characters probably would have taken the form of alternative skins for Bill, in the same vein as what we see with Cheryl Mason from Silent Hill being able to transform into other iconic Silent Hill characters. But as unfortunate as that may be, we are here to talk about the perks Bill brought to the table, so let's get started. I was going to call this perk a Fallen Giant, like I did Self-Care and Decisive Strike, but after thinking about it for longer than 5 seconds, I realized that isn't the best way to describe it. While it's true that you won't see this perk very often anymore, that's not because it was made worse like those previous examples, but rather because it was made redundant. While borrowed time isn't necessarily useless, it also isn't really necessary to bring it like it used to be. Once upon a time, this perk provided the bonus of giving someone you unhook 10 seconds of endurance, as well as 10 seconds of a small haste bonus. Probably about 5%, but I don't know for sure. This was extremely useful as an anti-tunneling perk, since it meant that going after the unhooked survivor wasn't always the easier option, and as such, was great for discouraging tunneling. The problem, if you could call it that, was that this was such a great benefit that for a long time, borrowed time was a mainstay in people's loadouts, especially people playing in groups, since that added protection was just that handy. Eventually, Behavior realized that this perk was too good, more specifically that it was too good to be just a perk, and eventually upgraded the perk to base kit status. Nowadays, Borrowed Time is essentially a perk that everybody has, and those benefits will forever and always apply when you unhook someone, which is great. But that leaves the actual perk in a bit of an awkward position, doesn't it? Borrowed Time still technically has the same benefit, it just extends the endurance and haste by an additional 10 seconds. This can definitely be helpful, since even with all the efforts that Behavior has made to discourage tunneling, it does still happen occasionally, and those who try to tunnel may choose to wait out the timer before swinging in order to down you again. So if the person who rescued you was packing the perk, the added duration can end up throwing them off. But at the end of the day, that likely won't stop the killer if they're determined enough. And that's really the only purpose this perk has ever served. Not a useless perk, but I would probably recommend taking something else, since this just isn't needed anymore. This perk gives the benefit of allowing you to see the aura of the hatch up to 32 meters away. This is the only thing that's done for a long time, and similarly to Borrowed Time, this is a perk that's become less valuable over time. Once upon a time, the hatch was a very complicated mechanic, where it would spawn early based on how many generators were complete. The exact formula was 1 generator per person, plus 1 more. This meant that if everyone was alive, then the hatch would not spawn until all 5 gens were done. Whereas if 2 people were alive, the hatch spawns once 3 gens are done. The catch was that the hatch spawned in, but it started out locked, so you would need a key to unlock it before you could use it. Though if all the generators were done and everybody was alive, this meant that one person could use the key to unlock it and then everybody could escape through the hatch to win the game. Naturally, that can't happen today, but that's not important. What matters is that this bonus would have been a lot more useful back in those days, but the funny thing about that is that back before the hatch rework, this perk had a completely different effect more akin to Laurie's Sole Survivor perk. So at the end of the day, Left Behind has never really been able to truly shine. As far as using this perk goes, I don't really have much to say about it, since the one bonus it comes with will only matter if you're the last man standing. And even then, the hatch's wind noise sound effect thing is loud enough that the perk is only necessary if your hearing isn't great. Basically, the only time I would ever use this is when you're trying to complete a hatch-related tome challenge, otherwise you probably shouldn't bother. Bill's final perk is Unbreakable, which firstly makes you recover 35% faster when downed. This is a pretty helpful bonus for punishing slugging, but the second benefit is what solidifies this as an anti-slugging perk, that benefit being the ability to revive yourself once per match. This is pretty cool. After all, one of the more frustrating elements of the game, in my eyes at least, is the fact that if the killer downs you and just leaves you there to go do other stuff, you can recover all the way to 95% only for the game to cut you off and demand that you get someone to finish healing you. Having the power to bypass this limit, even if it's only once in a game, is great. The biggest problem with this perk, not that it's the perk's fault, is that you will very rarely get the chance to actually revive yourself, as roughly 95% of the time, the killer will just pick you up after knocking you down. This means that unless you have a friend willing to distract the killer, which isn't guaranteed to work anyway, this perk ultimately fails because it requires the killer to play a certain way in order for you to get something out of it. That said, if you combine this with perks like Ash's Flip-Flop or Tap's Tenacity, you might be able to get something more out of this, but generally speaking, I would say this isn't worth using unless you tend to get slug block. Overall, I wouldn't say Bill's perks are bad necessarily, but they've all more or less been ruined by time. Okay, that's a bit of an exaggeration. Unbreakable is pretty much the same as it's always been, but the other two have become a lot less useful over the years because of how the game has changed, and poor Bill has kind of been left behind as a result. But I want to know what you think. Am I being too hard on Unbreakable? Am I exaggerating the downfall of borrowed time a bit too much? Feel free to discuss in the comments, but in the meantime, I have more work to do. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.